Last summer, I attended a wedding. And the thing about weddings is that generally you only get invited to them if at least one of the people getting married feels quite strongly that you should be there. And the other thing about weddings is they tend to be full of people that you've never met before. So it turns out that this person who feels quite strongly about you feels equally strongly about a whole room full of people that you don't know. So it's this potent mix of intense friends and complete strangers. And if it's a decent wedding, there'll be champagne all day. And then the dancing will start. And in the case of this wedding, it was a Scottish Cayley dance, which is quite helpful for a room full of complete strangers and intense friends, because it has this combination of formality. You're given instructions, the movements are quite regimented, you're told what to do, and yet it's incredibly intimate. You're partnered quite intimately with someone you don't know, and you whirl your way from partner to partner until you've connected with everybody in the room, in every permutation and combination of strangers and friends. And as I was at this wedding, whirling around in this dance that built up in its momentum, and it became quite exhilarating, I had a little rest, and I sat on a haystack, and I just watched this whirling organism take place around me, and it seemed that it had become this thing itself. It had become a dance. And I wondered what it would look like if each pair of feet in the room was supplied with an infinite flow of paint. What would the traces be like on the floor of this dance? I wondered if they would look something like this. These beautiful interweaving lines of colour that are being mapped by the human Connectome project, which is tracing all the neural pathways in a single human brain. And I wondered also if these traces left by this dance might look something like these images, which are maps of human connectivity between a plethora of brains across the internet. So if you take your scale out from micro to macro, do you see a similar pattern of connectivity? And then I thought, if I apply this same approach to my own practice, my own small theatre design practice based in London, by this analogy, who would have been my dancing partners over the past year? And this would have been a list of them. Earlier in the year, with Kanye West designing his performance in Atlantic City. I've been working with Kanye for 8 years, and the more layered and complex and electronic and fabricated the texture of his music becomes, the more his instinct seems to be to provide an environment for this music that is minimal and is referring to nature. It seems that however complex the sounds, he feels they resonate most in an environment of epic grandeur. Earlier in the year, the project was Kanye West and Jay-Z's Watch the Throne tour. And again, it's the same kind of palette. Electronica meets nature, predators coming through LED. But there's more space around it. Jay-Z's central interest is words. For him, it's about the poetry, fundamentally. And the audience know the words. When you stand at Watch the Throne, people are chanting the words to one another all the way through the concert. They know every word. You need to allow space for these words to resonate. You can't overcrowd it with your own interpretation of the images. Sometimes just one light is enough. So by this analogy of dancing from one imaginative collaboration to another, from Kanye West and Jay-Z across to Mikhail Bulgakov, Soviet novelist writing in the 1940s, all the rules changed. This couldn't be more of a contrast to the world of Kanye and Jay-Z. This is a world of bricked up Soviet bureaucracy. There's no vista, there's no space. 1940s Russia, probably one of the most limiting times for a human imagination to try to survive in. And Bulgakov and his characters in his novel try to get through it by means of an imaginative force against bureaucracy. And the way we express that in the design is through projecting onto this wall and finally insisting that the wall crack and fall down. From The Master and Margarita, this production with Theatre de Complicité of Bulgakov's novel, across to the Olympic closing ceremony. Both pieces were rehearsing at London Three Mills studios. So geographically, to go from one project to the next was a walk along the corridor. But the mind shift required to go from one project to the other was, of course, far greater. I was given a brief for the London Olympic closing ceremony. Design a stage set in the form of the Union Jack flag. A set of rules and regulations itself, the Union Jack flag. What on earth could I do with it? First thing to do is to try and understand it. Why is this flag as it is? Google. What do I find? This sketch done in 1603 by the graphic designers that James I approached to help him forge the English and the Scottish flag together as he tried to forge them into one country. You can see that he entirely ignored their proposals. And instead, he stuck the English flag on top of the Scottish flag, and then later in 1801, the Irish flag would just be stuck on from behind. What to do with it? I needed help. I Googled fine artists' uses of this flag, tried to find some other creative reinterpretation of it, and I didn't find much. If you Google art interpretations of Union Jack flag now, you will find quite a lot. Since the Olympics, I think attitudes towards it have changed. But certainly in 2011, I got a bit of Beatles, I got a bit of Britpop, and of course I got this. And this was encouraging. What could I do that wasn't confrontational, that wasn't destructive, that could be irreverent but had to be celebratory, but had this kind of energy and approach to the flag that the Sex Pistols had in the 70s? And the answer came by translating the form of the flag from geometry, from rigid triangles and rectangles into paint. Phew, this could work. What if you take the flag and detonate a firework through it, and then explode that over the shape of an Olympic stadium? A relief. Because finally I'd found, I think, a way into those rules and regulations of the flag. From the London Olympic closing ceremony over to Rihanna. And as in most busy design practices, ideas tend to cross-pollinate, cross-fertilize. So some of that Olympic paint splattered over to the Brit Awards, and the same idea was reinterpreted for her performance. And the useful thing about working with Rihanna is there's quite a lot of waiting around involved, which meant I had time to read Schopenhauer, which you need to read, the philosophy of Schopenhauer, if you want to try and understand Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal. So having gleaned as much as I could of the concepts of Schopenhauer, over to Copenhagen for this opera. From Wagner, from Copenhagen, back to London for Hector Berlioz's epic opera, The Trojans. So Berlioz is writing in the mid-19th century, and he's reworking Virgil's Aeneid, which was written in 20 BC, which is itself a reworking of Homer's Iliad, written in 850 BC. It's kind of a slow motion Google image search. Ideas and imaginations standing on the shoulders of other imaginations across 2 millennia. I had an instinct that I wanted the Trojan horse, which is the center of the story, to be made out of guns, to be made out of weapons. It seemed to me that this act of amnesty, it's a fake act of amnesty, it turns out. The Greeks are telling the Trojans that the war has ended, when of course it hasn't. The Trojan horse will be treacherous. So, again, looking for inspiration, Google. Horse made out of guns. There's nothing on Google. Thank God, no one's already done it. All right, sculpture made out of guns. Let's see if there's anything. And of course, someone's already done it. My idea standing on the shoulders of the work of this artist. The other extreme in this opera is society at peace, a society like a beehive. Look at the work, look at the architecture of African hill tribes. Again, Google search. I wouldn't know what this looked like. I haven't been there if I weren't able to Google search. And it seems to me that it's almost like a dating agency for imagination, Google search in some ways. Ideas, imaginations, collaborating with other imaginations without ever having met one another. It's useful to go back to the Greeks to understand how ideas have evolved over millennia, of course. The word idea itself comes from the Greek, ideon, to see. Not to think, but to see. And that word, ideon, comes from the Indo-European stem word, vide, from which comes videre, vision, to see, from which also comes witan, the Old English witan, and the German wissen, to know. So from the same Indo-European root stem word comes to see and to know, nothing to do with thinking, seeing and knowing. And it wasn't until the 1640s that there's the earliest recorded use of the word idea to mean something that's a process of the result of thinking. And that's no coincidence, because 1640s, the Enlightenment, that was the period during which philosophers were beginning to transplant their faith in God with their faith in the workings of the human mind. Before then, no one talked about thinking. They talked about seeing and knowing. And I think that's a useful connection to make, because I think when people ask me, how do you have ideas? What is the process of having an idea? I think we all know that feeling, and it is probably a chemical feeling that we have when we feel like we are having an idea. But what's really happening? What's really happening is that it's almost like finding the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle. The other pieces of the jigsaw are already there, and it's a case of being able to see the space between the jigsaw puzzle pieces to know that final piece has actually arrived. So any idea you think you're having, what you're really doing is completing a network of ideas that you have already had. From London back to Denmark, following my course through the year, to Janacek's piece, The Cunning Little Vixen, early 20th century opera, written by a man at the end of his life, considering the biological cycle of life, considering man's position in nature. So, same kind of territory as Kanye West, but set to Moravian folk tunes. What do I research? Biological cycle of life, cell structures. Cell structures. And I don't know anything about this. I'm just seeing. I've got my Google glasses on. Everyone in this room has a different pair of Google glasses. If you Google the origin of the word idea, you'll come up with a completely different thing to me, because your set of empty places in your jigsaw puzzle are different shaped to mine. So here I am, not understanding, just seeing, and hoping to know something from what I see. Cell structures. What does the music tell me to Google? Moravian folk tunes, Moravian folk art, cut-ups, paper cuts, Polish paper cuts. Oh, I found one here that's a Western interpretation of a Polish paper cut through a piece of architecture. Leads me to think of Far Eastern origami. And here's Western fashion's interpretation of Far Eastern origami. I'm pinging back and forth Google sites, internet sites from East, from West, getting connected as I have these ideas. And Google search now, to me, feels like thinking. I use it not just to look at the work of others, I use it to search for my own work. If I'm in a meeting with a collaborator and I want to refer to something I did a few years ago, it's quicker just to Google it sometimes. I don't want to interrupt my train of thought. I want to keep thinking. I don't want to search, I want to think. So if I Google search it, I won't have to interrupt my train of thought for so long. If I want to show someone an image of a building that's 2 blocks down from my street, I won't go out there, get my camera out, take the photo. Google search can keep thinking, not interrupt the train of thought. So one of the things I start to wonder as I'm sitting on my haystack with this dance still whirling around me is, how did all this start? What was the first act of imagination? What was the first human act of imagination? Go home, Google search. What was it? A million different answers, but the one that appeals to me, the one that I start to research further, is the consensus of evolutionary biologists that the first act of imagination happened about 50,000 years ago. And they called it the Paleolithic Revolution. And Paleolithic man, up to that point, he'd been fighting and fleeing, he'd been sitting around a fire, staying awake, trying not to get eaten by predators. And then something happened. He became aware, the consensus goes, that the people sitting with him around the fire, one by one, died, became aware of death, essentially. No other species is aware of death. Other species know they are alive, they know pain in the throes of being killed, but they don't anticipate death. So they don't fear it. Could it be, some of these evolutionary biologists suggest, could it be that it was fear of death that led to the development of structures in the human brain to try and alleviate fear of death? Could it be that natural selection selected those members of the human species who'd found a way not to be afraid of death? Because it stands to reason, if you're scared of dying, then you're not going to be as confident launching into battle to go and get some meat for the rest of your clan. Evolution is going to favor those who are not afraid of death. What could you do with if you're scared of death? What could help you alleviate it? How about an afterlife myth? And the evidence seems to suggest that one of the first things that all human cultures did across the globe, having developed the capacity for imagining non-physical realities, one of the first things that they did with it was to imagine life after death, the possibility of life after death, to alleviate the fear of death. Certainly when you read Shakespeare, when you read the metaphysical poets of the 16th century, in the 17th century, there's a lot of concern about immortality through words. One of John Donne's famous poems, "Death, thou shalt die." I can overcome my own mortality if I leave a set of words that will be read beyond my death. If my words can continue to have a life in the imaginations of the living beyond my death. And could it be that as the world of ideas expands exponentially through connections across the internet, that we are perhaps more alive than ever, and that we are in an incredibly powerful position of creativity as all of our ideas are able to influence the ideas of others all across the globe? It seems to me it's an incredibly powerful time we find ourselves in. This was one of the first acts of human imagination. 40,000 BC, in a cave in Spain. Somebody decided to get some colored dust, put it around their hand and say, "I was here, this was my hand, I did this." And now our hands, to me, feel like so directly communicating with our ways of thinking. It's almost like the dendrites in our brains extend right out to our fingertips as we flicker along the keyboard, reaching out across the internet for strains of thought that will complement our own. And these were the heady thoughts that I had sitting on a haystack at a wedding in Devon. Thank you very much.